Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Everybody who works with a computer has dealt with this. Most likely, it shows up as the blue screen of death. In the past, it might have been a little unhappy computer icon or a broken disk. It can also show up as an endless spinning colored wheel. It doesn't matter what it is, it means one thing. Your machine is busted, and it's time to call IT. Well, what happens if 8.5 million people from all around the world, from companies large and small using systems that range from casual to important to critical, all have to call IT at once?
I'm not sure anybody seriously contemplated a situation of this kind that would impact the number of machines that were impacted in quite this way.
Last Friday, a cybersecurity company named CrowdStrike managed to crash a full 1% of the world's computers. It is the largest outage in history so far. And the implications of it are profound, but so are the practical consequences. As several days later, some of these computers still are not back online. So what exactly happened here? Was nobody prepared for something like this? What can we learn from the CrowdStrike outage to make our increasingly digital world more resilient? And will we? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Jesse Hirsh is a technologist and a futurist. A lot of his work involves dealing with cybersecurity. You can learn more about him at jessehirsh.com or by searching for EcoPunks. Hey, Jesse.
Hey, Jordan.
Why don't you start, for the more technologically, digitally, and cybersecurity illiterate among us, by telling us what exactly is CrowdStrike?
CrowdStrike is a cybersecurity company that has been very successful in protecting enterprise customers. While they certainly are available to end users and consumers, they've been incredibly successful when it comes to ensuring that large systems are able to operate and are able to be secure. And that may be the paradox or the contradiction in terms of them having such a spectacular failure.
When we talk about they provide cybersecurity to large corporations and firms, what are they actually doing? How does their software mesh with the systems it's used on?
Well, in this case, quite intimately, and it, of course, depends. CrowdStrike does run on multiple platforms, and this story is really about Windows, Microsoft Windows, failing. And in particular, what CrowdStrike does is it makes sure that no one's messing with the system. No one's hacking it. No one's engaging in malware by changing files. No one's modifying anything to do a backdoor. And the reason that's so difficult with software is software's changing all the time. I mean, any Windows user knows that you're going to have updates that you need to apply, that, Windows as a platform is always changing. And so CrowdStrike is kind of like the virtual police. They're there to make sure that no illicit software enters into the operating system. But of course, that means that they have very privileged, very intimate access to the Windows operating system, which means when they make an oopsie, it can have very catastrophic effects in terms of, in this case, making sure that that Windows operating system can't even boot in the first place and goes into what's called the blue screen of death, which is basically when the operating system panics and completely dies.
You mentioned they're massively successful. How widely is their software used? Give us a sense of how much of the globe it spans.
It's hard to measure, partly because even CrowdStrike can't really measure because not all of its clients use this machine and all of its computers. But in this case, it was 1% of all the world's computers that were affected, which is an obscene number of computers.
Yeah.
When you think about our entire society depends upon technology in order to function. But in particular, these were crucial systems like the computers that run airlines, the computers that run television companies, the computers that run all sorts of crucial systems. And it's because of that intimate access. It's because in technical terms, CrowdStrike has access to the Windows kernel, which is the central nervous system, the brain, essentially. That means that they were able to do what basically no one else other than Microsoft can do, which is disable these computers in such a crippling manner. And to your point about scale, this is unprecedented. This was the largest outage of any kind in the history of computers, and one that I think both Microsoft and CrowdStrike are kind of scrambling because they're still not yet all back online, even though there have been some heroic efforts to get all these computers back on. Days later, they're still struggling to get them all back.
We've so far danced around what exactly happened. You called it an oopsie and mentioned, an outage. What exactly occurred on Friday morning? What do we know about how all these computers went down?
Well, I mentioned software updates, that this is the reality of running software in our contemporary society. All software is dynamic. It's constantly improved. And in this case, it was CrowdStrike pushing forward a patch, an update to their own software to improve it. And while the forensic details of what happened were still unclear, we know the general kind of sketch of it, which is they did test this new software on their own systems. But unfortunately, that testing was not adequate. And when they pushed this out to all of their clients, instant failure. And what happened is basically they ended up going into what's called a boot loop, where they die and try to get back up and they can't get back up. And at that point, it required a manual fix that in the first couple of days, the only way to get these systems back online was to physically go to the machine and make some changes to the driver that ended up being affected. Since then, both Microsoft and CrowdStrike have released automated tools that don't require physical access. But it is still a difficult thing to get these things back online. And to go back to your question, this was just a software update that unfortunately was not tested sufficiently. We don't know the actual technical details of that testing. CrowdStrike is saying, yeah, look, we did test it, it worked. But fundamentally, they didn't test it well enough.
In a minute, I want to talk about the larger implications of systems built this way. But first, when 1% of the world's computers go down because of this, what happens in the real world? What exactly occurred in the hours and, to your point, even days following this collapse?
Well, chaos is the instant, and then cascading failure is the legacy. And I say chaos because this reflects how, as a society, we do not have sufficient technical literacy, right? We depend upon technical systems that when they fail, we don't know what to do. We don't have a plan B. So airports, I think, were the most chaotic because, these are people who aren't at home, right? They're traveling and all of a sudden their flights are canceled and they don't know how to get on a new flight and they may be thousands of kilometers away from home. And the problem for airlines is it then creates the cascading failure, where they operate very efficiently so that when flights get canceled, you need to bump people. Well, where are you bumping them to? And in particular, Delta Airlines has faced the largest disruption from this, and it's because their scheduling software was partly affected. And then because they were canceling flights, they had to reschedule all of their pilots, all of their flight attendants. And because that software was impacted, again, cascading failure, systems systems that depend on systems that depend on systems. And all of a sudden, no one knows what to do because we're a brittle society. We don't have the resilience. We don't have the protocols to say, okay, what happens if we have a catastrophic computer failure? What do we do then? Instead, everyone's looking at Microsoft and CrowdStrike going, okay, guys, can you fix it? And because it was so difficult to fix, I feel sorry for all the IT guys who didn't really get much of a weekend. But this is what it takes to deal with such a catastrophic failure that we're fundamentally not prepared for because we just assume that these computers are going to work.
Why are we fundamentally unprepared for? Why do we assume that these computers will always work? Because everybody who works with digital equipment in any industry has had instances of their own computer failing, or even if it's just within a company, a software bug or whatever. Like, how are we not prepared for something on this scale if companies like airlines are trusting basically their entire business to them?
I think a little bit of it is complacency, a little of it is wishful thinking, but I think a lot of it is ubiquity. If we think about the concept of ubiquity, it literally means invisible, right? Our technology, our reliance upon computers is so widespread, so ubiquitous that it's invisible. It's like electricity. Mm-hmm. We just assume it's going to work. Now, to your point, we're kind of in a pandemic of cybersecurity where we're hearing about outages, we're hearing about malware disabling everything from library systems to car dealerships. So you're right. We should know that this technology is actually quite fragile. But it's gotten to such a point of dependence that we assume it works, not just because, in their defense, it does, right? Like,
most of the time, it's fine.
Right. Like most weekends when you want to fly, the airport works. And just because it didn't work this time, again, human nature is we don't want to look at these types of terrible scenarios, but we have to. And whether it's electricity, whether it's water, or whether it's computers, these systems will have problems, will require maintenance, will at times not work the way we want. So you have to have a plan B, the way you might have a generator at your house to make sure there's electricity. And unfortunately, when it comes to the way in which computers, the way in which cybersecurity is currently set up, it's a lot of wishful thinking and just plain ignorance of people just not understanding how this stuff works. So when it breaks, it's really scary.
I am one of those people that doesn't quite understand how this stuff works. What does a plan B even look like for something like Delta Airlines losing their entire computer network?
I mean, that's an excellent example, and partly because it's inexcusable for an airline not to have a plan B, right? People's lives, and I just don't mean the safety part of you're in an airplane, so you want to make sure that everything's working, but it's scary to be thousands of kilometers away from home and to be stranded for days, not to mention expensive. So the plan B involves having systems that are prepared to take their place, right? In many cases, the data all exists, right? The database that has access to scheduling for flights or scheduling for staff, that stuff is there. Often it's just the interface, right? It's just allowing the staff to be able to access this stuff. So having redundant systems, having backup systems, having contingency plans, all of that is feasible for an airline that has the resources. Unfortunately, airlines rarely invest in anything that takes from their bottom line. This is why they charge us so much for, having a seat that can recline or being able to have extra bags. But the reality is this kind of emergency planning is essential for any business, small businesses or large enterprises. The same way that you might go through, hey, what happens if we all get sick, or what happens if the power goes out? I tell my clients all the time, plan for the internet to go out, plan for a malware incident, plan for all of your computer systems going online so that when it happens, you're ready. Because as we know from the news, it happens increasingly and to just about anybody.
When you say it happens increasingly, what does that actually look like, and why are these incidents increasing?
Well, I think, this particular episode we're talking about is perhaps the least likely, right? Where this is not a malicious cyber attack. This is not a cyber terror incident. This was a screw up. And it's a screw up on a scale that's unprecedented. But other times screw ups happen. But what I'm talking about really is cyber crime and cyber espionage and malware. And these are the types of incidents that are increasing both in severity and in volume. I mean, as an aside, the cybersecurity industry is booming right now. That's why CrowdStrike is able to make a mistake like this and not go out of business.
Right.
That's the irony. Like, if anything, if I was a customer of CrowdStrike, I'd be like, never again. But the reality is the threats that CrowdStrike is protecting against are so severe and so increasing that's why this fundamentally will be nothing to them. And the problem really has to do with both our reliance upon technology, that, healthcare organizations, for example, are being attacked because they rely upon that technology to function. So they're more likely to pay the ransom of a malware. And all of this stuff is increasing partly because it's profitable. For criminals, there's a huge industry to be made, whether it's in ransomware, whether it's in scams, because there are now a wave of scams taking advantage of this weekend's outage. That's taking advantage of all the people who are stranded or scared. But the other side to this is geopolitical, right? The other side to this is Russia, is China, is North Korea, is the United States, is Myanmar, for example. I just read a recent report around how they are a center of excellence when it comes to identity theft as a source of revenue for their dictatorship. Cybercrime is a booming industry, and unfortunately, it is companies and users who are the prey to a growing world of predators who are really leveraging our ignorance and reliance upon technology for their commercial gain.
That's a couple times now that you've mentioned that we're either ignorant about cybersecurity or we don't understand it. What don't we understand about cybersecurity?
Well, I'm not even talking about cybersecurity. I don't think we understand how our computers work. I don't think we understand how our phones work. I don't think we understand how our technology works.
Right.
We've allowed for the emergence of essentially a clergy, right? A group of people who are really specialized, really smart, and they control how our technology operates, and we just rely upon them. Whether there are IT folk or increasingly it's all in the cloud, we are abdicating the responsibility to understand our tools, to understand our systems, be able to take them apart. And I say this because I'm a farmer, as you know, and as farmers, we pride ourselves on being able to understand all the stuff we need to grow our crops and raise our animals.
Right.
And so I find it a bit of a paradox that our entire society depends upon technology and yet doesn't really understand how to secure it.
This is like why folks don't know how to fix their own cars anymore, right? I don't, by the way.
Which are being hacked. And cars are being hacked. That's how you steal a car these days. You use a little wireless device to drive up to someone's house so that you extend the key fob to then unlock the security and drive away, right? So this hacking is happening all over. And to your larger point, I think our problem with cybersecurity is we see it as an inconvenience, right? We see it as annoying. We're like, oh no, I got to do that update. I don't want to do the update. I'm going to focus on doing my work. Or, oh no, the IT department won't allow me to access that website. I'll just find a workaround. I'll use a VPN. So insofar as it's an adversarial relationship between cybersecurity and the users, or even worse, that the users think that cybersecurity is not their job, they don't have to be responsible for it, that then allows the criminals and the profiteers to just run rampant and be able to create essentially an insecure internet as a whole, which is kind of where we're at, that we could have created a secure internet, but now we've got a really insecure one, and it's creating these sensational news events on a regular basis.
In terms of the adversarial relationship between the user and cybersecurity or IT and not understanding fundamentally how our computers work, is there a way to fix that? Or have we gone too far down the road and these systems are too far advanced now for the average person to really dive in and get a sense of how they work? And we have to trust something to keep us safe.
Well, I think one of the magical or one of the incredible things about technology, and in particular, internet and software, is that it moves so fast. So at no time is it too late. At no time have we gone too far down the road, because we're moving so fast down that road that we could always take a different direction. So there is always, I think, an opportunity to create greater transparency, to foster greater literacy, and to create systems that are secure by design, or that are private by design from a privacy perspective. And it really comes down to how we make those choices. And I think for businesses, there's going to be a clear financial incentive to embrace better security practices. Because if you are Delta Airlines, this has been a very costly several days. And I'm sure there are lots of other businesses that are less visible, less sensational, that have equally had very costly several days and are forced to reassess their practices. So I think it's never too late to take a new direction. And I personally promote a concept called participatory cybersecurity, that cybersecurity can't be left to experts, that everybody has to be involved, that it has to be democratized, it has to be accessible, that we have to focus on literacy, and the businesses and organizations who embrace that don't get hacked. Right? They don't get infected by malware. They have plans in place to deal with the disruptions that come from the internet. And I think we're going to see a kind of, those who are able to swim will survive and those who can't will sink. And it'll come down to your willingness to learn about the technology that you depend on. As individuals, we may not make that choice, but businesses, I think, are going to be forced to, because depending upon Microsoft and CrowdStrike is great when it works. But when it doesn't work, that's when you start to incur the types of losses and nightmares that unfortunately a lot of businesses have in the last few days.
When we talk about macro causes of this kind of stuff, how much of the massive impact of this and other similar events is due to the fact that there's only a few big fish in the pool these days, right? Like, we seem to be incredibly dependent on systems provided by Amazon or provided by Google or a massive cybersecurity firm. Are monopolies impacting our ability to rely on, sort of multiple backups?
Yes, I think this is very much an issue of monopoly, an issue of oligopoly. I think increased competition, especially in the cybersecurity space, would not only create less opportunities for these types of outages, but it would also foster literacy through competition, because in competing for services, they would have to be educating the marketplace. But at the same time, governments, ironically, play a very important role here. Now, I don't agree with Microsoft, but they've kind of thrown shade at Europe, because they're arguing that the reason CrowdStrike had the privileged access they do to the Windows operating system is because the European Union mandated that Microsoft do this. So Microsoft is kind of saying, well, if it wasn't for those meddling Europeans, this never would have happened. But to your point, then there also wouldn't have been a CrowdStrike in the first place, and it just would have been Microsoft with a full monopoly. So it is an issue of market concentration, but it's also an issue of government regulation. Because here's the other crazy part of this. The cybersecurity industry exists because governments are the largest buyers of exploits, of hacks, right? Intelligence agencies around the world spend a lot of money paying hackers for tools that they can use to spy on each other. And so the world of espionage creates a very profitable market for hackers, which then further incentivizes the insecurity of the internet as we know it. So while, yes, industry plays a very important role in either securing or failing to secure the internet as we know it, it's fundamentally governments that are responsible for this, and public policy that could play a role in making a more secure internet. So I think it's important that we don't let governments off the hook when it comes to understanding why we're in the mess that we're currently in.
You mentioned 1% of the world's computers go completely down, the largest outage in history. Is this a real wake-up call that will change the way some of these large companies do business, or is this the largest outage in history so far?
It's definitely the largest outage so far. It will be eclipsed. We will see much a larger catastrophes than this, whether self-inflicted or whether the result of cyber conflict or hacking. I think, however, we are going to see a lot of lessons learned from this. I think CrowdStrike, for example, is for sure going to have to testify before Congress. There's going to be public inquiries as to how this happened. But honestly, I think it's the small businesses, it's the individuals, it's the large enterprises that are nimble enough to adapt. I think they're the ones who are going to be the primary beneficiaries from this, who are going to realize, hey, maybe we should learn about our stuff and figure out these kinds of resiliency plans. But as for the industry itself, to your earlier point, it still is monopoly. It still is oligopoly. And as a result, I think the Delta Airlines of the world are not really going to learn from this particular bad episode. But hopefully their customers do, and will decide to take another means of transportation when going on that summer holiday.
Jesse, thank you. It's always a pleasure and very illuminating, especially for those of us who don't think as much about this stuff as we should.
Always a pleasure, Jordan.
Jesse Hirsh, one of the best people to explain our incredibly complex digital world. That was The Big Story. For more from us, head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. If you enjoyed that conversation with Jesse, plug his name into the search engine at the bottom. You'll find a few more episodes featuring him. You can send us feedback, and if you want us to pass it along to Jesse, we will. The way to get in touch with us, as always, by phone, 416-935-5935, or by sending us an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.